Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Sadu, and today we're going to be chatting about how low carb, high fat diets stack up to high carb, low fat diets in regards to fat loss. Now, for the sake of this discussion, we're going to say that protein is equivalent in both setups. So we're going to take protein out of the equation by saying it's set at, say, 1 gram per pound of body weight. We're also going to say that calories are equated in both setups because obviously we want to compare apples to apples here. So what are the definitions of a low carb, high fat diet and a high carb, low fat diet? I would consider low carb to be a total of 150 grams of carbohydrates per day or less. We've already established that protein was set, so the remainder of calories would be filled in via fat. I'd consider a high carb diet to be around 300 grams of carbohydrates per day or more. And again, we already established that protein is set, so the remainder of the calories would be filled in via fat. Now, obviously in the low carb setup, fat is going to be higher because carbs are lower, and in the high carb setup, fat is going to be lower because carbs are higher. Now, given these parameters where we're comparing apples to apples because protein and calories are equated for, which approach is better for fat loss? The short answer is, in theory, they'll both produce the same fat loss results, but in practice, they turn out to be pretty different, typically, and I'll explain why. Most of the foods that we eat have some or a lot of fat in them as is, and therefore when it comes to adherence, the high carb, low fat approach is a lot more difficult to follow because you need to be extremely mindful about what foods you choose or else you'll blow your calorie budget. On the flip side, the low carb, high fat approach is easier to follow for most folks, practically speaking, because they already eat a lot of fat as it is, and therefore by reducing carbs like bread, rice, potatoes, etc., they can still choose most of the same foods minus those starchy carbs mentioned. For example, I've followed both of these approaches and I've had clients use both of these approaches, and I can say with complete certainty that they both work. However, the high carb, low fat approach requires a lot more careful food decisions because, like I mentioned, it's just so easy to overeat on fat. And when you've already got a bunch of high carb foods in your day-to-day routine, that's a great way to blow your calorie budget because high carb, low fat tends to turn into high carb, high fat. And high carb, high fat is essentially the baseline diet of folks who are overweight. They undereat protein, they overeat fat, they overeat carbs, and that is the perfect recipe to pile on body fat. Foods that you typically see on a high carb, low fat diet are things like lean meat and fish, low fat dairy, bread, rice, potatoes, oats, fruit, and veggies. And as far as sauces and flavors go, you've got to stick to things like herbs and spices and lower calorie sauces like soy sauce and hot sauce. Foods that you typically see on a low carb, high fat diet are all the protein options, not just low fat ones, but also higher fat ones like fatty cuts of meat, fish, bacon, etc. You also see lots of oils, nuts, seeds, butter, avocado, coconut products, and of course veggies. You might even be able to fit a little bit amount of fruit in there. Sauce-wise, you've got a lot more room for calorie-dense sauces because, again, fats are high. You obviously don't see a lot of bread, rice, potatoes, and oats because these options are high in carbohydrates. Now, which approach for the vast majority of people is easier to follow? It's without a doubt the low-carb, high-fat diet because it requires less effort and careful tracking. If you just cut out or cut back on high-carb foods like bread, rice, potatoes, oats, and fruit, you're done. You can continue eating the same way that you had been aside from those higher-carb options. But the higher carb, lower fat approach requires a lot more diligence around food decisions because you have to carefully pick your protein options. You need to be mindful of getting bread, rice, potatoes, oats, fruit, etc. But you can't add much of any fat to your diet. So you can't put peanut butter on your bread, you can't add butter to your potatoes, and you can't throw a handful of nuts in your oats. Also, eating out at restaurants becomes more difficult on a higher carb, lower fat diet because restaurants already cook with ridiculous amounts of fat, and therefore you have to be really mindful about what protein option you choose, how it's cooked, all the add-ons, sauces, flavorings, etc. versus a low carb, high fat person is just like, hold the potato, done. It's just so much easier in practice to say, hold the potato versus be mindful of the protein, how your meal was cooked, oil and butter wise, as well as things like sauces, marinades, and add-ons. It doesn't mean that a high carb, low fat approach can't be followed. I've done it plenty of times and gotten great results. It just requires more effort and diligence. Now that you have this perspective, it's probably a lot easier to see why folks think that carbs are inherently fattening, because when they add them to their diets, they don't reduce their fat intake. They just add carbs, which adds calories. But if they were to simultaneously reduce their fat intake when adding additional carbs, they'd be able to maintain or even lose weight. However, it's more difficult in practice to do, and more importantly, they just don't do it. There's also something to be said for carbs and added fats, meaning most folks don't just add carbs to their diet on their own either. They add carbs and then they add additional fats too. So for example, no one adds just dry bread to their diet. They add bread with peanut butter and jelly, or potatoes with butter and sour cream, or pasta with really calorie dense heavy sauces. So there's no magical fat gaining properties to carbohydrates. It's just the way in which we eat them in combination with high fat foods that drives our total calorie intake up. As a quick aside, it's worth mentioning that both the high carb, low fat, and low carb, high fat approaches don't have much of any room for processed junk foods, because hyper palatable treats are pretty much all high carb and high fat, and that's why they're easy to gain weight on, because they're so incredibly calorie dense. There aren't very many tasty processed foods out there that are low carb and high fat, or high carb and low fat. They're mostly all high carb and high fat, and that's why we run into issues with them, alongside the fact that they're so hyper palatable and so easy to overeat. But that's a whole nother podcast in itself. So both approaches work when they're adhered to, but what is the better approach for you as an individual given your goals, commitment, tendencies, food preferences, etc.? It depends, as it always does, but if you're looking for the approach that requires less overall effort in tracking, it's without a doubt the low carb, high fat diet. If you like tracking more closely and you have a very high activity level, or you're looking to push performance up, the higher carb, lower fat setup is likely going to be better for you. Like I mentioned before, I've followed both approaches and they both work great for fat loss. However, the high carb, low fat approach is tougher to adhere to and follow on a day-to-day basis. So for the vast majority of folks, lower carb, higher fat is going to be the way to go, practically speaking. Now you might be wondering, Marcus, what about moderate carb, moderate fat? You can do that. However, it does require more careful attention than the low carb, high fat setup, but less so than the high carb, low fat setup. So it's smack dab in the middle. I typically use a moderate carb, moderate fat approach with most of my clients because they get to include carbs, which are delicious and nice to eat, but they also have a moderate amount of fat in their diet, meaning their food is quite flavorful, and fat improves texture as well, which is a big part of the food experience. However, we do track our food via portioning because overall calories are king. If you're not losing weight, it's because you're eating too many calories. You guys don't hear me making absolute statements very often. I'm a nuanced guy and I love to dig into the details, but when it comes to fat loss, you have to be in a calorie deficit. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And if you hear anyone say that calories don't matter for fat loss, run in the other direction. Folks will often blame things like hormones, menopause, starvation mode, or not eating enough. That's all bullshit. It's calorie intake. Now, it absolutely matters as far as how you set up your nutrition in regards to sustainability, preferences, your goals, lifestyle, schedule. All that stuff matters if you want to be successful long term. But what all of those things boil down to at the end of the day is calories in versus calories out. You cannot work around that simple truth no matter how you jig it up. If you're interested in applying for one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. Follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness and feel free to friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. Lastly, be sure to hit subscribe on whatever platform you're using. Thanks so much for tuning in and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.